For 23 years, Robert McKenzie had lived under a false name, believing his secret was buried forever. Then Sean Connery walked into his local Edinburgh pub. The man who played the world's greatest spy had somehow uncovered the truth that police, journalists, and even Mackenzie's own family had failed to discover. What Sean whispered that night would expose a decades-old mystery. If you've ever wondered how the skills Sean perfected as James Bond translated into real life, make sure to subscribe, because this story will show you just how sharp the legendary actor's instincts really were. November 20th, 1998, was supposed to be an unremarkable Friday evening in Edinburgh. Sean Connery had finished a day of meetings with his financial advisors regarding his growing property investments in Scotland, and he'd chosen the Rose and Crown for exactly the reasons any sensible celebrity would. It was tucked away from the main tourist routes, frequented by locals who respected privacy, and served the kind of authentic Scottish atmosphere that reminded him of his working-class roots. At 68, Sean had learned to value these quiet moments, away from the relentless attention that came with being the world's most famous secret agent. The pub itself was a study in understated elegance, with dark wood paneling that had absorbed decades of conversation and laughter, brass fixtures that gleamed softly in the amber light, and the kind of worn leather chairs that seemed to embrace their occupants. Sean had settled into his usual corner booth, positioning himself with his back to the wall, in a habit that directors had incorporated into countless Bond scenes, though few realized it stemmed from genuine instinct rather than cinematic calculation. His whiskey sat untouched as he reviewed documents from the afternoon's meetings, occasionally glancing up to observe the evening's regular customers with the same attention to detail that had made his performances so compelling. The stranger entered at precisely 7:45, and Sean noticed him immediately. There was something about the man's movements that triggered the actor's finely tuned awareness, too deliberate, too careful, as if he were performing normalcy rather than living it. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard experience, wearing clothes that were well maintained but several years out of fashion. Most tellingly, his eyes moved constantly, cataloguing exits and assessing potential threats in a pattern Sean recognized from his own training with military consultants during his Bond years. The man ordered a pint of bitter and took a seat at the bar, positioning himself where he could observe both the entrance and the interior of the pub. Sean watched as the stranger's fingers drummed nervously against his glass, a rhythm that seemed familiar though he couldn't immediately place it. There was something about the set of the man's shoulders, the way he held his head slightly tilted to favor his right ear, that stirred memories Sean couldn't quite grasp. He found himself studying the stranger's reflection in the mirror behind the bar, trying to reconcile the face before him with an image that remained frustratingly just beyond recall. But what happened next would prove that Sean Connery's reputation for observation and intuition extended far beyond the movie screen. As the stranger lifted his glass for the third time, he performed a small gesture that unlocked a flood of recognition in Sean's mind. He wiped the rim with his sleeve in a precise circular motion, exactly 3 times, before drinking. It was a habit so specific, so ingrained, that Sean suddenly knew exactly who he was looking at, despite the passage of more than 2 decades and the dramatic changes that time and circumstances had wrought. Rising from his booth with the fluid grace that had made him a natural for action sequences, Sean approached the bar with purpose. The stranger sensed his approach and tensed visibly, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket pocket before he recognized the approaching figure. Sean positioned himself beside the man and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, ensuring their conversation would remain private, despite the pub's modest crowd. Robert Alexander McKenzie, born February 14, 1943, in Stirling, reported killed in a car accident outside Belfast on March 9, 1975. I know who you are. The effect was immediate and profound. The glass slipped from Robert's hands, shattering against the stone floor with a sound that momentarily silenced the entire pub. His face drained of color as if Sean's words had been a physical blow, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. For several seconds he seemed unable to speak, staring at Sean with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. The other patrons resumed their conversations after a brief pause, assuming they'd witnessed nothing more than clumsiness, but Sean knew he was looking at a man whose deepest secret had just been exposed by someone he'd never expected to encounter in this quiet Edinburgh pub. Robert's voice, when he finally managed to speak, was barely audible above the ambient noise of the pub. "That's impossible. That man is dead. Has been for 23 years. But even as he spoke the words, his body language betrayed the truth of Sean's recognition. His hands trembled as he attempted to clean up the broken glass, and he kept glancing toward the pub's exits as if calculating escape routes. The confident posture he'd maintained upon entering had evaporated completely, replaced by the hunched shoulders and defensive movements of a man whose worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Sean signaled the bartender to bring towels for the spilled drink and another pint for Robert, using the brief distraction to study the man more closely. The years had not been kind to Robert McKenzie. There were stress lines around his eyes that spoke of constant vigilance, a slight tremor in his hands that suggested either medical issues or the long-term effects of sustained anxiety, and a quality to his gaze that Sean recognized from his own mirror during the most difficult periods of his career. This was a man who had been running from something for so long that paranoia had become his natural state, and Sean's sudden appearance had shattered the illusion of safety he'd built around his false identity. The truth, as Sean had pieced it together from his remarkable memory and observational skills, was both more complex and more tragic than anyone in that pub could have imagined. Robert McKenzie hadn't died in a car accident outside Belfast in 1975. He had staged his own death to escape circumstances that had made his continued existence under his real name impossible. The details of those circumstances would emerge over the course of their conversation, painting a picture of a man caught between impossible choices, who had chosen survival over truth, exile over honor. What Sean had recognized wasn't just physical mannerisms, but the accumulated weight of a shared experience that created an unbreakable bond between them. Both men had lived portions of their lives under intense scrutiny. Both had made sacrifices that the general public could never fully understand, and both carried secrets that shaped their daily existence in ways that were invisible to casual observers. The difference was that Sean's secrets were the manageable kind that came with celebrity, while Robert's were the kind that required him to disappear completely from his former life. The story that emerged over the next 2 hours, told in whispered fragments between Robert's nervous glances at the door, revealed a tale of espionage, betrayal, and impossible moral choices that would have impressed the writers of any Bond film. Robert had been a communications specialist working for British intelligence during the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, with access to information that could have changed the course of the conflict. When he discovered evidence of operations that violated both international law and basic human decency, he found himself facing a choice between complicity and treason, with no third option that would allow him to maintain both his conscience and his life. The car accident that supposedly killed Robert McKenzie had been carefully orchestrated with the help of sympathetic colleagues who understood that his continued existence posed an unacceptable risk to operations they couldn't officially acknowledge. His death had been convincing enough to satisfy both his handlers and the various parties who wanted him silenced, but it had also required him to abandon everything and everyone he'd ever known. For 23 years, he had lived under carefully constructed false identities, moving from place to place whenever he felt his security had been compromised, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting relationships or achieve the kind of stability that most people took for granted. Sean listened to this extraordinary tale with the same focused attention he brought to script analysis, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the moral complexities involved. He didn't judge Robert's choices or question the necessity of his extreme measures, recognizing that the man before him had been forced into circumstances where traditional concepts of right and wrong became inadequate guides for action. Instead, he offered something far more valuable, the understanding of someone who had spent his career portraying characters who faced similar impossible choices, and who recognized the courage required to sacrifice everything for principle. As the evening progressed and the pub gradually emptied of other customers, Robert began to relax slightly, though he never completely lost the watchful tension that had become his natural state. He spoke about the loneliness of his existence, the constant fear of discovery, and the way that living under a false identity slowly eroded one's sense of self until the line between performance and reality became impossible to distinguish. Sean found himself drawing parallels to his own experience of being so closely identified with James Bond that his public persona sometimes felt more real than his private self, though he recognized that Robert's situation was far more extreme and dangerous. The conversation revealed that Robert had been living in Edinburgh for nearly 3 years under the name William Thompson, working as a part-time bookkeeper for several small businesses and living in a modest flat near the university. He had chosen Edinburgh partly because it was large enough to provide anonymity, while remaining small enough that unusual behavior would be noticed and reported, creating a natural early warning system against potential surveillance. He had also been drawn by the city's literary heritage, and the sense that it was a place where someone could reinvent themselves without abandoning their essential Scottish identity. What neither man fully understood at the time was that their meeting represented a crucial turning point in Robert's long exile from his former life. Sean's recognition had initially terrified him because it suggested that his carefully maintained cover might be deteriorating, but as their conversation continued, he began to realize that it might actually represent an opportunity for something he had thought lost forever: genuine human connection with someone who understood the weight of secrets and the price of public scrutiny. Sean, for his part, found himself energized by the encounter in ways that surprised him. The skills he had developed for inhabiting complex characters, combined with his natural empathy and his own experience of living under intense public attention, had allowed him to recognize not just Robert's identity, but his fundamental humanity. The exercise of those skills in service of genuine human need rather than commercial entertainment reminded him why he had been drawn to acting in the first place, and reinforced his belief that the best performances came from deep understanding of human nature rather than technical technique. As closing time approached, both men seemed reluctant to end their conversation, understanding that they had shared something rare and valuable that might never be repeated. Sean offered Robert his private phone number, something he guarded carefully and shared with very few people, along with an invitation to contact him if he ever needed help or simply wanted to talk with someone who understood the complexities of living with secrets. Robert accepted the gesture with visible emotion, recognizing it as the first genuine offer of friendship he had received in more than 2 decades. The walk back to their respective homes took them in different directions, but both men found themselves changed by the encounter. Sean returned to his elegant townhouse in the new town, with a renewed appreciation for the ordinary freedoms he had sometimes taken for granted. The ability to use his real name, to maintain long-term relationships, to build a life that extended beyond mere survival. Robert made his way back to his modest flat with something he hadn't experienced in 23 years. Hope that his exile might eventually lead to something more than just continued existence. The friendship that developed over the following months proved beneficial to both men in ways that neither had anticipated. Sean found in Robert an intelligent conversationalist who could discuss literature, politics, and philosophy without the agenda or superficiality that often characterized his interactions with other celebrities and industry professionals. Robert discovered in Sean not just understanding but practical support as his new friend used his connections and resources to help improve his security and living situation without compromising his carefully maintained anonymity. More importantly, their relationship provided both men with a reminder that human connection transcends circumstances, that empathy and understanding can bridge even the most unusual gaps between different life experiences. Sean's ability to recognize Robert despite decades of careful concealment demonstrated the power of truly observant attention to human detail, while Robert's willingness to trust someone with his secret showed that even the most damaged capacity for human connection could be restored under the right circumstances. The story of their meeting in the Rose and Crown became a closely guarded secret between them, shared with no one else during Sean's lifetime. But it represented something profound about the man behind the James Bond legend, that his greatest performance might have been the simple act of treating a frightened stranger with dignity, understanding, and friendship when those qualities were most desperately needed. In recognizing Robert McKenzie, Sean Connery had done more than solve a mystery. He had restored a lost soul to the human community, from which his circumstances had forced him into exile. Years later, after Sean's death, Robert would reflect on that November evening as the moment when his life began again, after 23 years of mere survival. The man who had played the world's most famous spy had used his real-world skills not for adventure or excitement, but for the simple act of human kindness that reminded a forgotten man that he was still worthy of friendship and respect. It was perhaps the most James Bond thing Sean Connery ever did, though it happened not on a movie set, but in a quiet Edinburgh pub, where two men shared whiskey and discovered that recognition, understanding, and compassion could triumph over fear, isolation, and the weight of secrets that had seemed too heavy to bear alone.